So our last snippet for this week is going to look at constitutional change during the Civil War itself. And there are two primary areas here. The second, which we're going to finish, is the question of slavery and the aftermath of the Civil War. The first is the extraordinary change in political strength caused by the secession. I mean, we kind of know this intuitively, but it's worth sort of reminding here. Because the South had become disproportionately Democratic in the years before the Civil War, when these states secede, the result is a dominant position by the Republicans in the Senate, and a dominant position by the Republicans in the House as well, and which means that the party can sort of push through aspects of its agenda which were not necessarily tied to the issue of slavery. Um, and there's a flurry of legislation that's passed through Congress, basically with Republican votes during the Civil War itself. So one is the Homestead Act, which allows for the settling in areas of the Midwest and Rockies, for again, for white American settlers at a relatively small cost. So the goal is to increase the population of these relatively unpopulated areas, bring them in as states, and better integrate the country politically. Pretty important piece of legislation, the Land Grant College Act, it's really in the context of the times an extraordinary piece of legislation that calls for the creation of public universities that will have an arts and sciences curriculum, but also will deal with more what were perceived as more practical learning goals, agriculture and the mechanic arts. Um, and the result is this proliferation of colleges and universities, which until this time had really been concentrated in the East Coast, mostly private universities. So there would be all over the country, and so we have the University of Wisconsin and Michigan State and Ohio State, University of California, University of Nevada, Penn State, University of Maine. All of these public universities created through an act of Congress and financed, at least in part, through federal legislation. And then the Pacific Railroad Act of 1862, allowing for the creation of a railroad between Chicago and between the Midwest and the Pacific. And this is the ultimate line that they choose as a result, again, of federal subsidies through sort of cheap lands, which are then given to the railroad companies to exploit. So the pattern in all of these areas is to empower the federal government to address concrete what are seen as concrete economic and educational goals. So part of the element of Civil War republicanism is simply a more powerful federal role, that this promotion of states' rights, which has been such a big aspect of democratic constitutional vision before the Civil War, because the Democrats are so weakened, the Republicans are able to kind of replace it. We remember Lincoln, I think, as he was a hero of American democracy, as the person who plays the key role in the saving of the Union. But during much of the Civil War, he is perceived by the left wing of the Republican Party as sort of an incompetent, as someone who is too moderate, as someone who's not prosecuting the war aggressively enough. And again, on this issue of constitutional powers between president and the executive, Congress in the middle of the Civil War creates a new body called the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War, co-chaired by this man, Thaddeus Stevens, who was a Republican congressman from Pennsylvania. And in the last couple of years of the war, Congress is repeatedly pressing Lincoln to do more to bring the war to a close. And indeed, the war really isn't going all that well from a Northern perspective in 1861 or 1862. There's a major diplomatic embarrassment called the Trent Affair, when a couple of Southern ex-Southern senators who were appointed as diplomats for the for the South, John Slidell, John Mason, are captured aboard a British vessel. Because of course, remember the U.S. government does not recognize the Confederate as an independent state. So it says, we're not going to give these people diplomatic immunity. The British get very angry about this. They threaten the possibility of entering the Civil War in a peacekeeping role, perhaps on the side of the South. And so this question of how to run the war competently, there are a lot of Northerners who worry about Lincoln in this regard. The big case from the Supreme Court during the Civil War is this a case called the Prize Cases of 1863. It's a series of lawsuits that are brought by owners of commercial vessels, which had been seized as part of the Union blockade of the South. Lincoln, immediately after secession, had created a blockade of all of the southern ports. Now, under international law, a country has authority to impose a naval blockade against another country. But the position of the United States always during the Civil War was that the Confederate States were not another country. And so the owners of these vessels, which are seized for trying to run the blockade, go to the courts and they say, look, the president has said that the Confederacy is not another country. Therefore, he has no legal authority to seize our ships. Indeed, he committed an act of piracy under international law. And the Supreme Court, in a 5-4 decision, says what Lincoln did was constitutional. And the argument that the court makes is that, well, yes, it's true the Confederate States are not considered an independent country. They are engaged in insurrection against the Union, and because they are so engaged, Lincoln had the authority to impose the blockade. It's a kind of tricky ruling that the court comes up with in the Prize cases, but it's a major victory for the federal government. Nonetheless, as the 1864 campaign begins to roll around, there's some concern among the Republicans that Lincoln might be vulnerable for re-election. As a result of this, he makes what turns out to be a fateful decision and a terrible, terrible mistake. He jettisons his Republican vice president, Hannibal Hamlin, and replaces him with a former Democratic senator and Democratic military governor from Tennessee named Andrew Johnson. And Lincoln runs for re-election not as the Republican presidential candidate, but as the Union candidate, a coalition entity combining the Republican Party with pro-Union Democrats. Johnson, as a senator from Tennessee, Democratic senator from Tennessee, is the only senator from a state of the Confederacy to remain loyal to the Union after the Confederate States succeed. He was a populist white. He was a strong opponent of the sort of white plantation holders in the South, but he is just a virulent racist and someone who, while he agrees with Lincoln on eradicating Southern plantation politics, is really out of step with Lincoln on many other issues. But of course, the argument that Republicans make is, beggars can't be choosers. We need to win. We need to appeal to pro-war Democrats. And of course, Lincoln's going to serve out his entire second term anyway. So why do we need to worry? The Democrats nominate a very strong candidate, the former chairman, the former head of the Union military, General George McClellan. So he can't really be attacked as a pro-Confederate type. But the course of the war changes dramatically in the 1864 campaign. So what looked like a competitive campaign at the start of the effort winds up being a very easy win for Lincoln. He wins by around 10 points. He wins almost all of the electoral votes. It is almost certain that if Hamlin had been the vice presidential nominee rather than Johnson, that Lincoln would have been elected as well. But this does put Johnson in line for the presidency. As 1864 turns into 1865, Lincoln has to deal with a tricky and really unprecedented constitutional issue. Union forces have by this point divided the Confederacy into two. By capturing New Orleans and Vicksburg, they control the Mississippi River. They have liberated Tennessee, and through General Sherman, they are marching to the sea through Atlanta and eventually down to Savannah, and will then move up into the Carolinas. And there were increasingly aggressive attacks on Robert E. Lee's forces in Virginia. So the question that Lincoln has to address is, assuming that the Confederacy is not going to remain militarily occupied forever, what is it that needs to be done to allow the former states to return to the Union? And what Lincoln advocates is a pretty minimal this plan, which is it's called a Reconstruction Plan, pretty minimal plan. He wants the states of the ex-Confederacy to certainly slavery is going to be illegal, but beyond that, only and it's going to be illegal through a federal constitutional amendment, what becomes the 13th Amendment, which abolishes slavery. But beyond that, only 10% of people who voted in 1860 need to be to take an oath of loyalty to the Union. If you remember one of the earlier snippets that I showed, in many of these southern states, there were already more than 10% who were loyal to the Union in 1860, 61, when the secession votes were changed. And so this wasn't a particularly demanding threshold. Republicans in Congress, which come to be known as the Radical Republicans, want a much more robust Reconstruction plan. And I think in retrospect, they had the right side of the argument here. They want a majority of Southern voters to take an oath of loyalty to the Union. They want to ensure that Confederate office holders are not allowed to return to politics, either as voters or as office holders. They want to repudiate entirely the Confederate debt. The Confederate war effort, especially in 1863 onwards, is financed through bonds. They want to make those bonds worthless, and they want to ensure that the states enact constitutions that abolish slavery as well, to really kind of reaffirm that slavery will conclude. And as the Civil War comes to a conclusion, the question of whether the Lincoln vision of Reconstruction or the congressional vision of Reconstruction is very much an open question. And it's, to me, one of the great hypotheticals in American history to imagine if Lincoln had not been assassinated, he would have been attempting to push through this much more moderate plan. Would he have adjusted over time? I mean, we'll never know. But in any case, the subject of Reconstruction is very much an open one as the war concludes. And in the snippets for next week, we'll be looking at the kind of path beyond Reconstruction.